I go to church all the time. So like,
Green points equal Ukrainian and Polish.
oh, okay.
Let me restore it.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on crisis in Ukraine. Before we begin, I would just like to introduce Affiliated Society, which is hosting this discussion tonight, and also take a moment to thank our venue, Park Church Co-op, which has allowed us to use their space free of charge. If you have time, please drop a donation in their donation box before you leave. The Platypus Affiliated Society is an international organization of students dedicated to hosting a conversation on the left about the death of the left to investigate the potential for new and renewed emancipatory politics in the present. We take up the tasks and challenges of the old, the new, and the post-political left through research, journalism, and public forums such as this. We are located on several... Oh, the microphone. Oh, okay. I've already said it. We're located on universities around the world. In New York City, we have chapters at Columbia University, NYU, the New School, and Hunter College. And these chapters have collaborated today to bring you this event. So the topic of the event is Crisis in Ukraine, the Left and the Current Conflict. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some on the left have tried to understand the present crisis with reference to imperialism, national self-determination, and the role of Marxist revolutionaries like Lenin in the First World War. How should the left understand the current crisis in Ukraine? What is the meaning of these terms, imperialism, anti-imperialism, and national self-determination, for the left today? Lenin and other Marxists of the Second International called to turn the imperialist war into a civil war before the outbreak of World War I. How do we reflect upon this slogan today in the absence of an international left? And I would like to introduce the speakers who will be speaking in order from left to right. Christoph Lichtenberg is a member of the of the Bolshevik tendency and the political editor for Bolshevik. Daniel Lazare is a journalist who writes regularly for the Weekly Worker in London, published by the Communist Party of Great Britain. He is also the author of The Frozen Republic, How the Constitution is Paralyzing Democracy, and two other books dealing with the Constitution as well. And finally, A.M. Gidlitz is co-host of the Antifada podcast and author of I Want to Believe, Post-Sadism, UFOs, and Apocalypse Communism. Other writings on radical history and counterculture may be found featured in the New York Times, The Nation, and The New Inquiry. He's involved with the autonomous wood-run space in Ridgewood, Queens. So without further ado, Christoph, please.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody.
Please speak into the mic if you could. Thanks.
Okay, is that better? All right. So let's start with a little opinion poll of the audience. Could you please raise your hand if you would like to see the start of the Third World War? Okay, so I think we have a small minority, but overall we are agreed. So that's a good starting point. Let's see tonight how much further our agreement extends. So more than 1.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion, which makes it the biggest stream of refugees in Europe since the end of World War II. Ceasefire talks are currently underway, but Putin repeated that Russia would only stop its offensive if, quote, Kiev ceases hostilities and fulfills Russia's well-known requirements, end of quote. Putin referred to the 8-year-long aggression against the Donbas region in the east and the need to prevent Ukraine from advancing further towards NATO membership. Most of the bourgeois media reporting has framed the situation merely on its own terms, between evil, aggressive Russia and poor, defenseless Ukraine. Unfortunately, this has been mirrored by varying degrees by most of the left. And sadly, Tucker Carlson from Fox News has more accurate observations on Ukraine than many so-called Marxists these days. In 2004, the US-supported Orange Revolution in Ukraine prevented Viktor Yanukovych considered overly friendly with Russia, from winning the presidency. In 2010, Yanukovych, a corrupt servant of Ukraine's oligarchs, did manage to get elected president, and for the next several years sought to play Russia and the EU off against each other. In 2013, he rejected the EU's offer of a $10 billion loan conditional on implementation of a brutal austerity package and opted instead for a $15 billion bailout from Moscow that came with a promise of continuing subsidies for Ukraine's energy purchases. The Brookings Institution, based in Washington, D.C., estimated at the time that, quote, Russia today supports the Ukrainian economy to the tune of at least $5 billion, perhaps as much as $10 billion each year, end of quote. The US was not pleased with Yanukovych's decision and invested $5 billion in building a movement to remove him. The core of the Maidan movement was composed of far-right admirers of Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist who allied with the Nazis against the Soviets during World War II. It was hardly surprising that the government, which came to power in the wake of the successful coup in February 2014, was infested with fascists. One of the first moves of the new regime was to outlaw the use of Russian, mother tongue of much of the population in the country's eastern regions. This created an immediate and massive reaction and led to the establishment of two breakaway mini-republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. The Kremlin preempted any attempt to seize Russia's critically important naval base at Sevastopol by extending its military into Crimea, a move that was overwhelmingly approved in a subsequent popular referendum. Since then, there has been consistent military friction between the Kiev regime and the two rebel republics, with over 14,000 people dead. Mostly on the side of the Donbas people, I should add. It seems clear that the coup and subsequent US-backed right-wing government's declarations in favor of joining NATO was a key development leading to the current conflict. Ever since the triumph of counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, American imperialism has viewed Russia as potentially an immensely valuable target for looting. US think tanks have long toyed with the idea of breaking Russia up into several smaller and more manageable neo-colonies to be run by puppet regimes. A major part of this perspective has been the ever-increasing NATO encroachment towards the Russian border. This also needs to be understood in the context of the breaking of promises made at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In early 1990, US Secretary of State James Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that in exchange for agreeing to a creation of a reunified capitalist Germany, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. This promise was soon broken, and over the past 3 decades, NATO has expanded relentlessly eastward, absorbing 14 countries which had formerly been part of the Soviet bloc. The Kremlin has drawn the line at any further expansion, in particular ruling out NATO membership for Ukraine or Georgia, both of which border Russia. We recognize the right of the people of Crimea to rejoin Russia, just as we recognize the right of the Chechens to separate from Russia. Today, we recognize the right of Donetsk and Luhansk to separate from Ukraine. However, we categorically reject the idea that the rulers of Ukraine or Georgia have a right to join the NATO imperialist alliance targeting Russia. The left wing of the neither Moscow nor Washington movement tend to want to avoid taking a position on this issue, because recognizing such a right means aligning with the US State Department's position. Conversely, rejecting Ukraine's right to enlist as a pawn in the imperialist struggle to defeat Russia and to dismember Russia means defying the imperialist propaganda and being in favor of a Russian victory in their military campaign to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. In 2014, we opposed the clearly expressed intention of the NATO imperialist for Russian forces to be expelled from their Black Sea Sevastopol naval base. Russia, like China and Iran, has a right to defend its military installations and national territory against incursions by US or other imperialist forces. We recognize Russia's right to neutralize NATO missile sites established in neighboring East European countries without necessarily advocating that such action be carried out. Another important context of the current situation is the decline of the US as the world's hegemonic imperialist power, which is being reflected in their conflict with Germany over Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which would double the direct gas supply capacity from Russia to Germany. The US inflaming of the tensions between Russia and Ukraine appears to have largely been driven by the strategic necessity for America to get a wedge between Russia and Germany over Nord Stream 2 in order to retain its leading position vis-à-vis its Western European imperialist allies. Germany initially signaled its unwillingness to be drawn into US plans to confront Russia by not only refusing to send any additional troops to reinforce NATO's Eastern Front, but also banning any shipments of German weaponry to Ukraine. In signaling its opposition to American attempts to ratchet up tension with Russia, Berlin instead authorized a token shipment of 5,000 helmets to the Ukrainian military. They soon reversed this and have now allowed German-made weapons to be sent. US weapon shipments also come via Germany. The New York Times reported, within 48 hours of Mr. Biden approving the transfer of weapons from US military stockpiles on February 26, the first shipments, largely from Germany, were arriving at airfields near Ukraine's borders, officials said. A total of $350 million in military aid was delivered in just 5 days. It is significant that the US has been supplying Ukraine with weapons worth billions of dollars in the last several years, making it the third largest recipient of military aid after Israel and Egypt. The struggle to isolate and constrain Russia is key to US attempts to retain its predominance over its NATO allies. But the broader struggle for retention of global supremacy targets the Chinese deformed worker state. Meanwhile, Washington's refusal to normalize relations with Russia, where Stalinist rule was overturned and the Communist Party marginalized, has pushed the Kremlin into an ever closer military and economic alliance with China, based on their common need to resist American aggression. The decline of US imperialism is accompanied by an erosion in its capacity to forcibly impose its will, as well as its soft power appeal. Its hostility to the Iranian mullahs has pushed Tehran into a de facto alliance with Moscow and Beijing, signaled by the recent signing of major economic cooperation agreements signed with both China and Russia. China has designated Iran as a key player in the Middle Eastern component of its Belt and Road project. Revolutionaries support the struggles of indigenous forces, no matter how reactionary, who attempt to drive out imperialist occupiers, like the remaining US forces in Iraq and Syria. We welcome any assistance that Russia, Iran, or China may provide that helps accomplish that objective, while not offering any political support to Putin's reactionary pseudo-democratic regime in Moscow, nor to the Iranian theocracy. While we defend the Chinese deformed worker state against both foreign imperialist pressure and indigenous forces of counter-revolution, we advocate workers' political revolution to oust the bureaucratic Chinese Communist Party as the only means to open a road to genuine socialism. In a specific conflict between Ukraine and Russia that erupted, our assessment of the three main players in this crisis is roughly as follows. First, we have the imperialist United States, which is leading the NATO imperialist alliance, but resisting Zelensky's demand of establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, as this would mean war with Russia, the start of World War III. Secondly, we have dependent capitalist country Russia, which is qualitatively similar to, let's say, Brazil or Iran. And third, we have neo-colonial Ukraine, which is acting as a pawn, as a foot soldier for US NATO imperialism, and is doing the fighting on their behalf. Revolutionaries recognize Russia's right to militarily defend itself, and by extension Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, from any intrusion by NATO powers or their Ukrainian puppets. And we oppose all US NATO sanctions, threats, and military provocations. We take exactly the same attitude to imperialist bullying of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, and any other dependent capitalist country. We similarly oppose attempts to forcibly reincorporate the two breakaway republics in the Donbass back into Ukraine. What liberal bourgeois opinion fails to recognize is that while Russia is acting aggressively at a tactical level, invasion of Ukraine, it is doing so within an overall defensive strategic framework. Against extension of NATO right up to the Russian border, we consider Russia to be within its rights to take that threat off the agenda. Russia's capitalist oligarchs, like Putin, are indifferent to the concerns of working people, whether in Russia, Ukraine, or other countries of the near abroad. Putin deserves no political support whatsoever from revolutionary socialists. The only historically progressive road forward for the Russian people is through workers' revolution to overthrow his regime. The same applies to the rulers of Iran, Syria, and other capitalist neo-colonies. Yet the implacable hostility with which Marxists regard these regimes does not negate the urgency of defending them from imperialist provocations and aggression. The communist attitude to any adjustment of Ukraine's frontiers is chiefly determined by the will of the people involved, as in the case of Crimea. So if, for instance, Russia, in the areas of Ukraine where it does not have popular support of a clear majority, moves from military actions that are primarily against the infrastructure of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Azov battalion, to a strategy of attempting to impose a long-term occupation, we would no longer favor their victory. The current dangerous international conjuncture is just the latest manifestation of the fundamentally irrational character of global capitalism, a social system that is driven by the imperatives of capital accumulation to constantly engage in dangerous predatory activity. The crucial task before us is to rebuild a genuinely revolutionary movement internationally, committed to rooting itself in the struggles of the proletariat. Such a movement can only be constructed on the basis of a genuinely revolutionary internationalist program, based on the historical experience of the victorious Bolshevik Revolution. As a first approximation in the present circumstances, it is necessary to be able to distinguish between the rapacious US NATO imperialist predators and their intended victims, and being prepared to militarily block with the latter when they fight back against the former, without in any way offering political support to them. Here in the imperialist heartlands, we must do all we can to oppose and disrupt the actions of our own rulers' war efforts. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Christoph covered a lot of the ground I was going to go over, but I will just go over it very briefly. And I essentially agreed, I think, with 90% of what he had to say. I have a few quarrels around the edges, and perhaps one more important quarrel that deals with a more central question. Christoph is absolutely right. There's no doubt that that 1990, during the period of the breakup of the Soviet bloc, that all the key figures of the day, the key political figures, Secretary of State James Baker, President George Bush I, Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, even Margaret Thatcher, all assured Mikhail Gorbachev that if he agreed to the reunion of East and West Germany, which meant incorporating the former German Democratic Republic into NATO, that there would be no further NATO advance to the east. That was clear, and that goes with our understanding of the time, which was a time of heady optimism, of bourgeois utopianism, and also social democratic utopianism. So the Cold War was over, swords would be beaten into plowshares, a heavenly peace would descend upon the world, and at last the globe could attend to the myriad social problems that had been neglected during the Cold War. That was the prevailing attitude. And that just didn't last very long. And in fact, the period of 1989 and after actually saw a marked increase in military activity. Ironically, because you would think that the U.S. and the Soviet systems were so intrinsically hostile to one another, but curiously, that hostility led to a strangely stable relationship in which the two great powers kind of superintended the world and were able to contain major conflicts. And the removal of the Soviet Union, the Soviet counterforce, led to a huge increase in U.S. military activity. In December 1989, just a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. invaded Panama. Estimates are that it killed hundreds, even perhaps thousands of people in their bombing raids. The Persian War, the Persian Gulf War broke out in late 1990, and then the Balkan Wars erupted in 91, and also around the same time we saw a bunch of really nasty ethnic conflicts break out along the old Soviet periphery in Transnistria, Abkhazia, Chechnya, etc. And this growing instability led to both a push by NATO and a rush by the former Warsaw Pact nations, which led to the tremendous extension of NATO to the east, right up to the Soviet border, the Russian borders, I should say. And there's no doubt that as to who was on the defensive and who was on the aggressive. There's no doubt as to what the power balance lay. The Russia was a stricken, collapsed state. It was going through a social emergency that makes the Great Depression in this country seem like a cakewalk. And the U.S. took advantage of that. And in the Balkan Wars, to Russia's great alarm, the U.S. blamed Serbia for all the problems, targeted Serbia, and in early 1999 issued an ultimatum to Serbia to something called the Rambouillet Accords, which demanded the stationing, I think, of 30,000 NATO troops in a portion of Serbia, then Serbia, called Kosovo, free transit of NATO troops throughout Serbia, and exemption from Serbian law of those NATO troops. It was a call for an invasion, every bit as much explicit as Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. And so alarmed were the Russians that Boris Yeltsin, previously a pliant instrument of US foreign policy, essentially, as his health was failing, promoted a bright young ex-KGB member named Vladimir Putin, named him as his successor, with the clear mission of essentially resisting US aggression and the US strangulation of Russia. And US anger rose and rose and rose, and as it rose, Russia pushed back, and which led to more anger on the US part. And we all know the milestones. Putin opposed the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He supported the invasion of Afghanistan, but opposed the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He opposed the no-fly zone in Libya in 2011. And of course, when the former Soviet Republic of Georgia tried to take back control of a breakaway province called Ossetia, which was pro-Russian, Putin responded with a military offensive that swept through Georgia, and he could have gone into Tbilisi if he'd wished to, but he held back. And so all of which caused the U.S. temperature to rise more and more and more. The Euromaidan was another milestone. The seizure of the Crimean Peninsula was another milestone. Russian entry into the Syrian war to bolster the Assad regime, which was beginning to waver under pressure from Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, infuriated the Americans no end. And of course, when Donald Trump entered the White House, the Democratic Party, which is by now the more aggressive party in terms of imperial policy, blamed Trump's election on Putin. Putin was now elevated in Democratic Party mythology to this satanic figure, something out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, if you just sort of change the ethnicities around a bit, in which he could magically cause things to happen. He really had to push a button and riots would break out. Susan Rice actually accused the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Susan Rice was Obama's former national security advisor. She blamed those protests, the George Floyd protests, on Russian intervention. So where I disagree with Christoph, I don't recognize a right of Chechnya to secede. And the reason I don't is that clearly the US neoconservatives were supporting the Islamic fundamentalists in that war in order to peel Chechnya away, and then as part of a process of the unraveling of the entire Russian Federation southern tier. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who in 1997, in a best-selling book called The Grand Chessboard, called for ringing Russia with hostile states all around, including a highly militarized Ukraine, with the goal of breaking Russia up into three parts: a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, and a Far Eastern Russia. This is the goal. And I think that the Chechen War would have been a major step to that. And I think the question of imperialism is paramount, and so I think it would override any consideration for self-determination on the part of the Chechens. So I'm actually not unhappy that Russia won that war. I agree with Christoph that the Crimea was seized in order to head off a U.S.-NATO Ukrainian nationalist attempt to take control of the naval base at Sevastopol, which would have had the effect of essentially shutting off Russian access to the Black Sea, and also allowing the penetration into the southern tier by U.S. NATO forces, and especially if Georgia had wound up entering NATO as well. So that Brzezinski program would have been tremendously advanced if they had seized Sevastopol. And as for Donetsk and Luhansk, I don't recognize any special right of self-determination, but it's hardly surprising that a Ukrainian nationalist uprising in Kiev would give rise to an equal and opposite pro-Russian uprising in the East. And given those facts, then only in those circumstances, in other words, if the Ukraine was a democratic state, dedicated to equality for all citizens and all full language rights, I would not support a breakaway movement in Donetsk and Luhansk. But given the turn that Ukraine underwent, I certainly defend that right now. So that is what paved the way for the war, the increasingly aggressive policy on the part of NATO, and that the election of Joe Biden, his slogan is "America is back." His whole goal was to roll back the isolationism of Trump and to reestablish U.S. leadership of the Western Alliance, and as part of that was a get tough policy with Russia. This is a Democratic Party policy these days, especially. And it's very interesting to know that just last November, the Ukraine and the U.S. signed a strategic partnership agreement in which the U.S. endorsed Zelensky's goals of taking back Luhansk and Donetsk and taking back the Crimea. Now, can people here imagine what would happen if Russia and Syria had entered into a formal strategic partnership whose goal was to take back the Golan Heights from Israel? I mean, the alarm, the fury, the anger, the mobilization in both Washington and in Tel Aviv would have been indescribable. So therefore, it's hardly surprising that this caused serious alarm in Moscow, and that Putin took steps to sort of put his foot down, stop the NATO advance. That said, and I'm not sure whether you made this clear, this is what you were saying, but I do not support the invasion. Is the BT position that you do support the invasion? Or
It's Russia's right to
okay,
take care of
I do not support the invasion. I think the invasion it was, and I've always regarded Putin as a very cool and calculating actor on the world stage, and I think that this is a blunder of massive proportions. It's indefensible on any kind of democratic grounds. I think that he's he's created an Afghanistan on his doorstep, and therefore taken a good-sized problem and multiplied it many times over. And essentially, I mean, the best we can hope from the Ukraine now is that it'll be a bloody stalemate that will last for years and years and years, a massive bleeding wound in the side of Europe that will not go away, will fester, will become infected, will end up spreading. Okay. So enough with where we've been. And I've been going on for too long, so let me just try to wrap up really fast. I think that where we are now is that this crisis, the big question is whether this crisis leads to a nuclear war, which I think is unlikely in the near term. In the long term, it grows likelier and likelier the more the great wound festers. That's the worst case scenario. Another scenario is it turns into merely to a 1914, which of course would be disastrous beyond imagining. But even in the best case scenario, where you have the festering wound, but it spreads no farther, and Poland and Romania and the rest are not drawn into the war, and no one is stupid enough to impose a no-fly zone. I think that this is leading to a giant economic crisis. We're seeing the worst energy crunch since the 1970s. A dramatic spur to inflation, which today hit 7.9% in February. So we'll see what March holds, which is going to make all the more likely an even more massive crackdown by the central banks led by the Federal Reserve, which will throw the global economy into a savage recession. I just can't see any alternative to that. So for the working class international proletariat, even the proletariat that's not actually in the war zone, what the war means is militarization, authoritarianism and censorship, and inflation and layoffs, and other kinds of cutbacks as well. And the interesting thing about so I think that the left has got to form an anti-war movement. The interesting thing is it can't be an anti-war movement like the ones during Vietnam or Iraq, because those were led by essentially liberal to radical bourgeois elements. And those elements have removed themselves because they're all pro-war. So therefore, and whereas Vietnam took time, and it took place at a time of capitalist ebullience, and the Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq took part of the time. Well, there was a recession, but I think that this war will take part at a time of deep recession that will strike the working class politically and economically with huge force. And so therefore the anti-war movement that has got to form, and I think will form, will be a proletarian anti-war movement, one that is not led by liberal Democrats, who are all pro-war, but will be led by socialist, working class socialists. And in an article just out in the Weekly Worker, I formulated 4 demands, but on some reflection I'd like to extend those to 5. And these are the 5 demands that I think that such a movement must be built on. I've got to wrap up really fast, so I'm going over my time. They are no to NATO, no to unemployment and inflation, no to censorship, no to neo-Nazis, and no to war. Anyway, that's it.
So we got 1 for the invasion, 1 against. Now I'm the tiebreaker. It's a lot of pressure. Well, yeah, I'll begin by just, we're talking about like what the left should do. I think that's like that's really the stakes of what we're talking about. And so my idea of what the left is basically from my purview as a podcaster, as a blogger, that kind of thing. So it's mostly people my age or younger, mostly people kind of like me from the US or from the UK. People, a lot of people I know on Twitter. This is like a very limited view of the left. This is what I understand. And this left, for the most part, when the intelligence was coming out from the US State Department that an invasion was coming, said, that's bullshit, it's not happening, they're lying. And then when it happened, to their credit, most people said, well, we were wrong. We thought it was stupid to trust the US. We learned our lesson in the past. And so to their credit, to our credit, there's a lot of reappraisals of these categories. And we're rethinking what these frameworks, what their use is. So for example, the framework of imperialism. Previously, I typically hear the idea of imperialism essentially meaning the foreign policy of the United States and Israel, maybe the UK and France and a couple other countries. But now that's expanded to also Russia as an imperialist country. Then there's this framework of anti-fascism. Opposing fascism seemed like a very important thing for people my age to do in 2016, 2017. So looking at this conflict and wondering who's the bigger fascist and what side we should be on based on that has become a big part of the discourse. Like looking at the symbols of the paramilitaries in Russia or in Ukraine has become kind of an obsession of people in this left that I perceive. And then anti-racism is, of course, very important to us, coming from the struggles of Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd uprising. And anti-racism helps probably even way less than the other two. It's left people looking at a very important issue, which is the presence of non-white people in Ukraine within the flow of refugees and how they're being treated far worse than everyone else. And this is an important humanitarian question, but I don't think it helps us understand the war at all. So these categories are being scrambled, they're up for grabs, but what are the stakes of any of it? What does it matter? What side we come down on in terms of was the invasion justified or not? Is Russia imperialist or not? We don't have any politicians who we can lobby to vote for or against war credits. We don't have a working class base that can say, shut down the war machine, strike in these factories at these ports, or make peace, social peace, to make sure the war machine can function better. This is something of the left historically, but not today. So what does it matter, these categories? And I think probably the element of the question that's really I've been thinking about more that I think has some more stakes is this question of revolutionary defeatism and turning the imperialist war into a civil war. And I've got a theory about that, at least. I think that when we talk about revolutionary defeatism, we immediately start thinking about World War I, 1914. And I've heard some more compelling cases to be made about Russia's involvement in the war against Japan and how that failure led to the revolutions in Russia of 1905, in January of 1905. I think those are interesting parallels, especially the second one. But there's a parallel I'm more interested in, which is a revolution that happened in the Russian sphere of influence in January of 2022, 2 months ago, in Kazakhstan. On New Year's Day, there was the removal of fuel price caps, and the price of fuel went up twice overnight. So on January 2nd, there was the emergence of these big demonstrations in rural and industrial areas that spread very rapidly, exponentially around the country, eventually hitting the capital in what turned very quickly by January 4th and 5th into a full-blown insurrection. Tens or hundreds of thousands of people taking government buildings, taking the airport, taking TV stations, seizing armories, looting gun stores, defeating the police joining the crowd in cases, and the military joining the crowd in cases. The president agreeing to all demands of the people, but it didn't matter. And it was finally destroyed January 6th. Interesting synchronicity there, January 6th, when Putin brings in his paratroopers. I forget the name of the pact, but Kazakhstan's part of a pact with Russia, something like NATO. And as part of a regional peacekeeping operation, they slaughter the insurrection. And that was the end of it for January, at least. And this was really unprecedented in a way. This was something of a high watermark of a series of events that really begin sort of similarly, including similar uprisings in Belarus, I think it was just last year, Kyrgyzstan, and that's just that region, but also in South America in 2020 and 2019, in Chile and in Ecuador, in the United States with the George Floyd uprising, in Sudan in 2018. You know, these are things that begin somewhat similarly, going all the way back to the Arab Spring, and having a variety of reasons behind it, but mostly, and the ones that we really see the most proletarian elements, the most proletarian rage and organization, have to do with the immiseration of working class life, specifically around fuel and food prices. This was the cause of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Syria. Euromaidan was a bit of a different story. It was more about questions of political corruption, and Hong Kong as well. But the majority of these things, including arguably the George Floyd uprising, were about material questions, ultimately. And so I think that if we see this cycle of struggles, this wave of struggles, and we look at Kazakhstan as the most recent incidents, it's still rising. And in Kazakhstan, we have the first case of something like an insurrection, an armed insurrection that was poised to overthrow the state, to suppress the state. We don't know a lot about what the people in Kazakhstan wanted, where that was headed. We just know how it ended, the suppression by Putin. So I think now with the outbreak of this war, which, you know, seems like it was planned long before even January, but the two cases might be related. We're looking at a case where, on one hand, this might be a crushing defeat for Russia, not unlike the Russian Empire's defeat against Japan in 1904, causing a huge economic crisis in Russia, aside from what the sanctions happened. And, you know, even if it's something of a victory, even if they take Ukraine, we're looking at Russia that's going to be in a deep economic crisis and with a sense of defeat on some level that they didn't expect. But also we're looking at as you said, an economic crisis worldwide that's going to be much deeper than what even we've seen in 2008, for instance. Russia and Ukraine, of course, huge suppliers of grain. I've read statistics like a third of the world's grain come from this region. And even if the war were to stop today, there's going to be massive disruption of grain. Obviously, gas and oil is going to be massively disrupted. So these two indicators that are common to a lot of this rising wave of uprising are going to be massively, massively disrupted. These prices are going to go way up. We're going to see, you know, we usually shouldn't be so confident when we predict things like this, but we're going to see massive uprisings as a result of this. So in terms of what my left should be thinking about and what it should be preparing, you know, already in the United States, we're seeing people getting really mad about gas prices and about inflation and about food prices. And they absolutely should be, and I think that this would be a really good grounds for a new kind of social movement not only against capitalism in the state or what have you, but the argument from the Democrats is going to be this is Putin's war, this is Putin's inflation or whatever. And this will be a excellent opportunity to say, okay, fine, look at this geopolitical situation that led to this war, and people are uprising all around the world about gas and about food, and so all these people who are mad about this in Kazakhstan and Chile and wherever the next uprising comes, we're all in this together. We're all being made to pay for this stupid war that nobody wants. That might be the ground for an anti-war movement, besides like the question of who's the biggest Nazi or who's the biggest imperialist or whatever. But there's something that I'm really worried about, especially in the US context, which is that over the last couple years, the idea of insurrection, for example, or the idea of being against the state, has become closely identified with the right. And while January 6th and the anti-vax movement and the truckers and all this, I have some comrades who say, there's something material about these things. There's some reason to intervene here. I disagree with that. I think that these are petty bourgeois movements. I don't think that they're materially based, other than in the material concerns of the petty bourgeois. But if a movement popped up around gas prices, would it look like one of those movements? Would it have this kind of anti-Biden MAGA veneer? The Let's Go Brandon thing is really largely already about gas prices. They put these stickers of Joe Biden pointing to the gas prices on the fuel tanks. So my concern is that this movement, as it pops up, is going to look like a right-wing movement, or is going to have a right-wing vanguard. And the working class is going to identify with that. And the left is going to call this movement racist or reactionary or whatever. So I think what we should be doing, what the US left, this left that I understand, should be doing is preparing to intervene in that movement somehow, steer it away from the right, and steer it towards working class politics. Thanks.
Before we open up for Q&A, we are going to have a brief round of responses from the panelists. So just take 2 to 3 minutes if you want to say anything in response to the other speakers. And we'll go in the same order that we started in. So Christoph, you can begin.
Okay, I'll just take one point briefly. I'll pick on you, Daniel. You raised the question of independence for Chechnya and that you would have been opposed to Chechnya becoming independent since it would have fitted into the plans of US imperialism. And I think while that is true, it does not negate the right of an oppressed people to shake off their oppressors. And that has historically been the case, that sometimes one imperialist country will seek to exploit the situation in colonies of their competitor of the other imperialist country. But that doesn't mean that the oppressed people in that colony lose their right to struggle against their oppression. And I'll give you one example. Ireland in 1916 had an uprising against the British Empire. Absolutely justified. Drive the Brits out, of course. The Irish Republicans were small, fought very bravely, and suffered a crushing defeat. Germany had supplied arms, or tried to supply arms, because they thought it would give them an advantage versus Britain if Ireland went up in rebellion against the British Empire. In my opinion, and in Lenin's, that did not negate the right of the Irish people to struggle for freedom. And I think that is the model we should follow. We support the right of oppressed people to fight back against their oppressors.
Okay, well, I'll just need to take issue with that really fast. Yes, that's an easy question. Because Marxists are completely, not neutral, but equally hostile to both the British and the German empires. And so we therefore, we don't give a fig between them, and we're happy to see the Irish revolutionaries go their own way. And it's immaterial to us whether Germany supplied them with arms, just as immaterial to us that they supplied Lenin with a sealed train to to go through Finland to Russia. The difference, the better analogy, I believe, is with the Kurds, who we, of course, support self-determination of the Kurds, but the Kurds have lent themselves to becoming an instrument of U.S. imperialism, and therefore we cannot support the Kurdish military activities now, because clearly they are just nothing but cat's paws for the U.S. And in the case of, Brzezinski organized all the top neocons, scores of them, into a movement in support of the Islamist rebels in Chechnya who were receiving Saudi funding and were in the same way an instrument of U.S. imperialism. So yes, the Chechens should have self-determination, and efforts were made under the Soviets to do that. But in this context, a Chechen victory, besides being a victory for Al-Qaeda and other such forces, would have been a victory for the Saudi-U.S. alliance, and I just cannot see that. Just really, really fast, I disagree with a great deal of what you said, but my main quarrel is this idea of a social movement, because to me that summons up all these horrible, wretched social movements that we have seen over the last 20 years, from veganism to Me Too to everything under the sun. I do not support Black Lives. I supported the George Floyd rebellion. I did not see Black Lives Matter as a progressive answer to the problem of U.S. racism. And what is needed is not yet another of those social movements led by the middle-class radical intelligentsia. What we need is a movement of the working class, led by working-class socialists, who will essentially mobilize the class, as a self-conscious class that is increasingly aware of its great historical tradition and role, and not just another ephemeral, social movement, and which, by the way, can't get anywhere because these elements essentially are supporting the Democrats. Most of them are Democrats, and they are supporting the Democrats. Any movement has got to take an absolutely clear line against U.S. imperialism, and take the strongest possible line, putting the blame predominantly where it belongs, and that's why I said it's important to be no to NATO, no to inflation and unemployment, no to censorship and the militarization of our society, and no to war. Not just like they're both bad guys, and we support the good guy Zelensky because he's so cute and attractive in his T-shirt. We have got to oppose U.S. imperialism as absolutely as sharply as we opposed U.S. imperialism in Vietnam. And that's the only way you can create a working class movement that is socialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist. Not more of this social protest ephemera. Anyway.
Response? Yeah, I think maybe I misunderstood then, because basically what I'm talking about is something more like the George Floyd uprising and less like the organization Black Lives Matter, something more spontaneous and with teeth. And when I also what I'm talking about is not something that comes from like a leftist subculture. It's actually coming from people who pay for gas and are getting really mad about gas prices, and maybe they don't understand so much the complexities of the war, or they don't want to understand it. They want to know why everything costs so much, why they have to travel so far to go to work, et cetera. So this is, if we're talking about a social movement, it's going to be something more like that I see emerging, and I see not the left as a whole, but like this middle-class leftist movement trying to intervene in, but revolutionaries, as needing to intervene in, so it doesn't become a right-wing phenomenon. That's more what I mean.
But those are consumerist movements. We need workplace movements. We need unions and strikes against unemployment. When you have a consumerist movement based on that tends to put it in right-wing terms because it's consumerist, it's middle class. We need a workplace movement involving workers on the job, going on strike, forming unions, organizing, etc. And under their own power as workers. I mean, certainly socialists will certainly, try to exercise leadership, but the movement coming from the working class.
So this is my reference point is not like Me Too or like the animal rights movement, but Kazakhstan and Sudan and Chile, these massive ruptures that don't begin as strikes. They don't begin in the workplace. And they need to break through, and often they do. The Arab Spring broke through to strikes, as did Kazakhstan. When they're really successful, they break through into general strikes. But if we're looking at this cycle of struggles as where the proletarian is taking the offensive, and this is what I really believe today, then it does begin with these consumption questions of the price of living.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to open up to an audience Q&A. So since we have people both participating from the live stream and in the audience, I'm going to preference audience questions, but I will repeat them into the microphone so that people watching can hear them.
You can also talk into this mic if you come up and...
Oh, great. Okay, that might be better. So why don't we have audience members who want to ask questions, please come up to this microphone to speak. And then, Daniel, can you just watch the live stream for me and let me know when there are questions, and we can take some of those as well. But yeah, it is open now for audience questions.
I might have to pull this down. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay. This might fall off. Okay, I might just yell a little bit. So I guess I had a question about what you see as the role of the working class in producing the conditions that led to this war. Meaning, you've talked about the way in which maybe the working class might have an interest, like in terms of gas prices. Of course, that was already a problem before the sanctions. But there's something that seems kind of external about it, like as if you need to pique their interest about why it matters. Whereas the kind of classic theory of imperialism is that the working class was actually producing the conditions that had grown ripe and were driving nations into each other. In this case, you can treat NATO like a kind of standing army body of the United States. And likewise, this is probably where I disagree with Christoph. I don't think Russia is merely acting tactically aggressive and strategically defensive, because I think the US would claim the same thing with every single invasion that it ever does, that they would claim they're being defensive. So the reason I bring this up is if you're going to talk about the way in which a working class would intervene in some way, you would also be saying that they're producing some kind of something, some kind of condition by which it actually matters, and it's not just, let's go and get them, because why? So I was wondering if you three could reflect on that question. I can repeat it if it's not clear.
I'm not really quite sure. I mean, like, how did the working class create these conditions? I don't understand what you mean.
Well, you were talking about they're in factories, right? They're producing the system of capitalism, of capitalist production. I mean, this is bound up with, some of the interest in foreign policy of the United States. It doesn't just kind of fall out of nowhere, right? They are about maintaining the interest of the capitalist class.
So the workers maintain the interest of the capitalist class?
Well, they reproduce those conditions. Yeah.
What, pardon me?
Yeah, I mean, they produce capital.
Yes, but capital takes surplus power, surplus value from the working class. It exploits the working class.
Okay, so this can be your response, but I was just wondering if you could talk about it.
I think the working class creates wealth, but it's the capitalist class which exploits this labor, takes surplus value, applies it to profits, relentlessly seeks out new markets and new investment opportunities and tries to supervise global politics that is conducive to a neoliberal agenda. The conditions for the working workers around the world, but especially in the U.S., are plunging. Workers are under intense pressure. They have got to fight to stop this. Otherwise, they'll be ground down. We're returning to the 1880s in some ways with an impoverished working class, and we can't allow that. And the workers can't allow that, so they've got to fight back. They've been quiescent so far, but I'm quite sure that that will change.
I'll just give a very brief answer. So the question is, to what extent have the working class produced these conditions? I think only in the sense that we have not yet overthrown global capitalism and established world socialism. That's the only way in which we have contributed to these conditions, that we have not dislocated the capitalist system yet. But otherwise, I pretty much agree with what Daniel said.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that Euromaidan, even though I agree that it was captured by the right and went in this right/neoliberal direction that is hard to defend, was a working class initiative on some level. It led to a massive general strike in Ukraine, as much as we could say that the U.S. was propelling it or took advantage of it, it was a manufacture of the Ukrainian people. So the whole crisis is really based in the activity of the people, and certainly it's hard to say that what happened in Belarus last year, the protests in Russia, potential political crisis of Putin's party in general didn't lead to this in some way as well.
So, fair disclaimer, I've been a comrade of Christoph's for over 20 years, so I'm coming from things from the same perspective he does. But I've got a two-part question for the panelists. The first part is how you each define imperialism. And I ask that because I think that liberalism has greatly confused the way that that word is thrown around, and I hear it used as a synonym for militarism, for aggressive colonial settlerism. And I do not think a nation like Russia, or a nation like Israel for that matter, are imperialist, even though in the case of Israel, I would certainly condemn many of its actions. I look toward Lenin and his revision of the ideas that Hilferding had about imperialism in seeing it at its core involving the way advanced capitalist countries extract value from more backward colonial and semi-colonial countries, not subsidizing them, as my understanding is what's the main dynamic involved in Russia's relationships with many of the nations on its periphery. Trotsky said, in particular, that imperialism means the domination of finance capital. The Russians, I think if we look at this is part of the question or the follow-up to it, the crack in the hegemony of the imperialist world order, we see lots of signs of it and how short-lived the U.S. triumphal New World Orderism is, from the quagmire in the Middle East to the constant bubbles and economic crises of the last 2 decades. But also in 2008, we saw the Russians resist the encroachment by Georgia, and they didn't formally annex South Ossetia, despite the pleas of the population. But neither did they allow Georgian forces to re-enter the region and reassert their dominance. But this is not what imperialism looks like, right? At least, I don't think it does, but I'd ask the other speakers if they think that that's what it looks like. And for example, this is just one example. In 2010, the price of crude that was charged to the countries of the former Soviet Union that Russia had relationships was $20 less a barrel than what Russia was selling oil to for the other countries of the world. If Russia had charged the Commonwealth of Independent State nations the same price, it would have been an additional $389 billion in revenue from their exports. This is not what imperialism looks like, right? Unlike the imperialist powers whose predatory relationship with colonies center on pumping value out of them, Russia's weak capitalist class is not exploiting assets, but subsidizing their economy by supplying energy at prices that are below the global market rates. And I could go on with examples of their involvement with Syria, their involvement with Venezuela. Clearly what Russia has been trying to do is carve out an alliance and a space that resists the US domination, resists the US hegemony. It's made for some strange bedfellows. If people looked at that UN vote to condemn, and you looked at the nations that opposed the condemnation of Russia or abstained, it is like a list of the nations that have been victimized by the US, from Cuba to Nicaragua to Venezuela. So my second part of my question is, do you agree with Lenin's position that in a conflict between two imperialist nations, we should be dual defeatist, but in a conflict between a non-imperialist country and an imperialist country, we should take the side of the non-imperialist country?
Do you want to go first? First of all, yes, I agree with Lenin's view of capitalism, a view of imperialism. I do not think Russia is imperialist. Its power is far too minuscule. Its position on the world stage is primarily defensive. I mean, what you say about the fuel prices, I wasn't aware of that, but that sounds completely plausible and it's very interesting because Russia wants to maintain a series of buffer states. It wants to have friendly regimes. So its attitude towards Kazakhstan is precisely the opposite of the U.S. attitude towards Mexico, for example, which is absolutely rapacious. And poor Mexico has suffered for, what do they say? Mexico so far from God, so close to the United States. So I agree with you there, and the difference between Lenin's day and our day is that the U.S., which has achieved in that golden age of 1989 to 2001, had achieved something close to global hegemony, has devoted its attention to the superintendency of the entire global economic and legal structure, where it established all these rules for investment and set about just reorganizing the global economy in a way that no one had ever dared do before. And this created winners and losers, and it also involved the application of military force as well, a major increase in military force, which, yes, put Russia on the defensive. But I wouldn't regard Russia as a colonial state either. It's not a Syria. It is a regional power which is capable of projecting its power, not nearly to the extent of the U.S. So I would not defend it the way I would defend an Ethiopia against Mussolini, for example. I think that, and to do that in this context, by the way, means that we become hostile to any anti-war movement in Russia. I would be hostile to an anti-war movement in Russia that was pro-US, but I would not be hostile to an anti-war movement in Russia that adopted a policy of revolutionary defeatism and called for the working class to take power. I would solidarize with any such movement.
Well, if I may, one question, because you said that the main difference between our times and Lenin's is that the U.S., reorganizes the global economy. I mean, wasn't it the case in Lenin's time that Great Britain covered 25% of the surface of the globe? And would not a larger difference between our time and Lenin's time be the lack of what Lenin called in Socialism and War the subjective factor that leads to imperialism, namely a revolutionary movement for socialism on an international scale?
That certainly is one big difference. And whereas the British opted for direct administration of their colonies, the U.S. has opted for a different kind of indirect administration, which is it's a highly leveraged empire and therefore very unstable. But the U.S. has been able to manipulate the global legal, economic, and political structure in a way the British couldn't, because they also had rivals in Germany and France as well. So there were 3 or 4 depending on how you count them, major empires of the day, whereas now there really is only one. And so the U.S. essentially has the field to itself until it started cracking up in a major way starting in the early aughts. And there is no revolutionary socialist movement. That's, of course, all too true.
And did you have anything, he asked for definitions of imperialism. I do think that might be helpful for the audience. Did you have any sense of maybe how to answer that question?
No, not really. Like, I kind of sidestepped it because I don't think there's any stakes to it. I think that if all the leftists in this room and then all the leftists in the DSA or whatever came to some firm agreement on the definition, it would not matter, because that's just not where we have any ability to influence things.
Thanks. Let's take another question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. So, yeah, I'll preface. So I'm a Russian speaker from Kharkov. I'll just start out with that. And so it's curious, you answered part of my question because I was going to ask about your attitude to the anti-war protesters in Russia. So I appreciate that. But it is just curious to me as a leftist from another part of the world where this kind of like genuflection on the anti-imperialist left for Russia's geopolitical interests and Russia's sphere of influence, like all the stuff you said about Brzezinski and encirclement, like where does that come from? Why should the left care about the Russian state, particularly when it no longer even makes any pretense of being a socialist state? And it just seems to be this tendency of playing this game of risk and trading like ground level politics for geopolitics and wanting to support like any challenger to the hegemon regardless of what the nature of that challenger is. Because it's one thing to be a realist and say, well, Russia's a nuclear power and we shouldn't antagonize them because that creates a risk of nuclear war, and they have their own state agendas, which regardless of how good they are or not good, they're there. That I can completely understand, but the discourse often seems to tilt towards this, like that Russia has legitimate interests, right? And that's a value-loaded term in maintaining this ring of buffer states, which, by the way, like it doesn't give cheap energy as like a free gift out of the goodness of its heart. That's precisely the way it maintains political influence, because that's the only power it has, rather than the vast like soft power institutions that the U.S. and the West have. And yeah, it's a question of why we should value that over, say, the desire for sovereignty or self-determination of any of those Ring of Nations. That's first of all. And the second question is, if I sort of gleaned from what you said that you believe anti-imperialism and anti-US imperialism specifically should be the defining thing that we can rally the working class revolution around. And I would sort of question that, because some of the loudest voices against US imperialism today have nothing to do with the left. They're paleocons. Tucker Carlson has been a very big anti-war voice. So you have paleocons, you have 4chan Nazis, you have plenty of the international far right cheering on Russia. So I don't see where this thing that the opposition to US imperialism specifically, rather than say the opposition to rising fuel prices or consumption costs, is like the lodestone that the international working class should organize against, especially if you want to organize internationally with, say, progressive forces in regimes that are nominally opposed to the US. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think in answer to the comrade's question, we need to understand that we live in an epoch of an imperialist world order that has increasingly exhibited tensions and aggression towards other countries. And we need to understand that as socialists in this country, in the heartland of imperialism, we have a duty to act against the desires and the actions of our own capitalist rulers in their attempts to suppress, militarize, colonize, brutalize other countries, whether that is Venezuela or Iran or Russia. And there is a difference between whether a country is imperialist because of its high level of development and export of finance capital, etc., or if a country is not imperialist and is not shaping the world and is not exploiting and pillaging and oppressing other nations and the working class on a global scale. Imperialism is the main problem. Imperialism constitutes the main obstacle towards liberation of humanity. It is the biggest chains that enslaves humanity. That is the problem we're facing. So there is a huge difference between the US imperialist NATO-led alliance and a regional player like Russia or Iran. Yes, there might be nasty regimes, and we advocate the removal of this Putin or of the Iranian theocracy. But the removal of those regimes should be the work of the working class in those countries, not of Washington. That's the difference. And Russia has a right to defend itself. And let me say this, within living memory, Russia has suffered the invasion by an imperialist country. It cost them 20 million lives. People have not forgotten that. So you shouldn't be surprised if they react a little bit upset when their country is yet again encircled by people with pretty clear intentions. I don't blame them. So they try to take the issue off the agenda by going into Ukraine and not waiting for the first strike from their enemies. I don't blame them.
Well, first of all, I mean, we do believe in self-determination. I mean, I believe that that Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania have a right to have their borders respected. They should, they should be able to conduct their own affairs democratically. I think that's quite true. They should be democratic, and they should accord language rights to their Russian-speaking minorities, which they don't. They massively violate that with U.S. support and encouragement. And the more they do it, the more they give rise to ugly, social conflicts, which fairly invite Russian intervention. And the U.S. exploits these conflicts in order to promote ever more right-wing regimes in places like Tallinn or Kaunas or Vilnius. And so yes, we have to have national self-determination or national, some kind of right not to have your borders trampled, but that right is, depends on your adherence to proper democratic standards. And I agree. I mean, imagine if the Brzezinski strategy, works, and it still may work. Imagine if Russia is broken up into three parts, and the U.S. is able to deeply, to control, essentially reduce the three Russias to a semi-colonial status. It'll be able to outflank China from two sides. It'll gain control of Central Asia, all Central Asia. It'll detach, Xinjiang and Tibet from China, open up China to attack. The Central Asia will become a battle zone between Western imperialism and an isolated Chinese deformed worker state. I mean, this is a recipe for a world war, a Eurasian world war, which we must stop. We can't allow this because it'll consume, vast portions of humanity. So these U.S. imperialist designs have got to be stopped. This is of the utmost urgency.
In my view, there's a contradiction between the idea of class struggle, beginning with beginning in the workplace in the home where you pay rent, et cetera, and the idea of imperialist states versus worker states. I think we've really lost, in the last 100 years, the left has lost view of the class struggle as beginning on this more molecular level, and this is where we start to get the discourse that really focuses on these major geopolitical questions of imperialism, instead of looking at what is happening really, like, for example, in our city, in our neighborhoods, at our jobs. Leftists talking at their job about, is Russia imperialist? It's a good question. I'm interested in it. I've learned a lot listening to you talk. I'm not going to pretend to be able to argue with this tome, but I think the bigger question is the conditions of our exploitation as workers, and that's what I'm interested in from a revolutionary perspective. That's where I think it begins, and not between geopolitical order of imperialist states versus worker states or something like that.
Thank you. Okay, so I have two follow-up clarifications to the prior questions and then a question of my own. So first, for Gitlitz, I guess you kind of just answered it maybe, but what do you make of the line for defeatism? Should we advocate for one way or the other, or dual defeatism, or what? And then for Daniel Lazare, you said we should, that you would only, call for solidarity with peace anti-war protesters in Russia if they were not sympathetic to the U.S., if they were somehow hostile to the U.S., and if they were revolutionary, proletarian, etc. So what do you make of the anti-war protests in Russia is the question for you. Maybe I'll let you answer that, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, it's a good question about what it means to be defeatist from the U.S. perspective, because the anti-war movement as it currently exists seems to be this sort of Ukraine solidarity movement that's largely well-meaning, largely interested with humanitarian concerns, but with a right wing that wants further intervention. And so I guess the anti-war movement, you could say the more radical anti-war movement is questioning that calls for a no-fly zone, that those calls for intervention. So it's really nebulous about what it means to be defeatist or anti-war or anything like that. And it seems like to be anti-war right now is to sort of side with the EU policy of non-intervening and let Ukraine be invaded and destroyed in hopes that Russia will collapse in the meantime, right? So I don't know if defeatism really helps us understand this. Yeah.
I know that they have a response to that, though.
Well, first of all, the EU is intervening. They're pumping massive amounts of weapons into there. That is a massive intervention. So it's not true that they're not doing that. And defeatism means the earnest hope that your country goes down in defeat. And this was emerged out of the great imperialism debates in the Second International, because at the time, everybody found it very easy to criticize the other guy's imperialism. So everyone loved, criticizing Leopold II of Belgium because the horrors he was wreaking in the Belgian Congo. But the acid test came to your own imperialism. So British socialists had to mobilize against British imperialism and call for the overthrow of British imperialism, and rather than focusing on the other guys. Yes, if the U.S. were somehow humiliated in the Ukraine, if there was a huge loss of face by the U.S. military, that could potentially lead to amid the economic dislocations.
For U.S. military equipment. The failure of the equipment would mean a failure for the United States? I just don't see the connection.
Well, the U.S. is not involved in the war, so it's not posed with military defeat now. But if somehow it led to military defeat for the U.S., this could lead classically to another 1905, which is when the Tsar sent a fleet halfway around the world only to have it sunk by the Japanese. And there was such a loss of face and an exposure of profound incompetence that it completely shook the public support for the Tsar. So some kind of an analogous process here. And what was your question?
Well, the question for you was what you think of the anti-war movement in Russia. But let me just ask my other question as well, which is just, so it seems like with COVID, we saw really with Trump and with COVID, we saw like the beginnings of like a sort of rupture in neoliberalism where there's new kinds of restrictions on global movement of people and goods, of capital of all kinds. And now this is kind of putting the icing on the cake in the sense of like, well, like Pizza Hut and McDonald's are no longer in Russia. Like, is this the end of neoliberalism? Is this the weakening of US imperialism? Is that a good thing? Is that something we should welcome? Is this cultural bifurcation and separation of economies something that the left should welcome or something that the left should oppose? And then how does that put it with vis-a-vis neoliberalism?
You want to go there, Christoph?
I'm not sure if I will answer your question to your satisfaction, but I will try to outline what I see as sort of some of the moments of the decline of US imperialism. I think on the one hand, we see increased tension between US imperialism and other imperialist countries. As I was just chatting with Daniel early on, Germany has been acting far more independently in the last 25 years than it ever did since the end of the Second World War. Germany has always been a staunch ally of Uncle Sam. Whatever you want to do, we are right with you, right? That has changed. The German bourgeoisie is pursuing its own agenda, just like Japan and other countries, France, are acting very much according to their own agenda. The US has lost the grip as the bulldog that is leading the pack. So that's one feature. But ironically, as a result of the sanctions against Russia, we are also seeing a further decline, probably very soon, it's already underway, of the US dollar as the leading currency. And the sanctions against Russia are actually accelerating this. With Visa and other companies pulling out, what Russia will be forced to do, and is already doing, is switch towards payment systems developed by the Chinese. So they're decoupling from the leading dollar, which is only accelerating the decline of US imperialism. And this is the insanity of US foreign policy. We don't expect it to be rational, but their own actions, trumpeted as we are defenders of freedom, is actually undermining their own stability and their own position within the imperialist pecking order. That is some of the insanity that we see being acted out. I'll leave it at that.
Regarding the anti-war movement in Russia, no, I mean, if it's led by Navalny and their pro-U.S. forces, who will be acting in concert with the U.S. and the U.S. intelligence agencies, I can't support that at all. But I want to be absolutely as generous in my judgments. But if ordinary Russians take to the streets and say we don't want our kids killed, and we don't want the horrors of war descending upon us, and demand some more equitable system in Russia, then yes, I think that socialists should solidarize with that immensely. So that's what I think. But I think you can't do that unless you are absolutely crystal clear as to where what imperialism means and the role of imperialism. Because a vague kind of general kind of feeling about being sort of like people shouldn't kill one another, which is true, is going to lead to a dulling of judgments. And whereas the working class has got to make absolutely sure that it sees the U.S. imperialism as a chief enemy, it wants these adventures to stop, it wants an end to unemployment and inflation, and it wants an end to the militarization of global society, including the United States. I mean, censorship, the press, they're going wild. This is much worse than I saw during the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And I think that kind of neoliberalism is dead. We are moving towards a much more regimented kind of society and economy. and a much poorer one too, and one that'll be much harder on the working class.
Okay. This is, I guess, is more of a clarifying question for Andy, but if anyone else has anything to say, you're more than welcome to, of course. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you take the difference to be between, you know, like you were saying, that this conflict right now is creating this possibility for a working class movement that is different than past, as you call, petty bourgeois movements. And so I guess, are there any ideological or material conditions that you think are qualitatively different from that they're creating these grounds now that didn't for these petty bourgeois movements? Because I know you mentioned inflation, but what is different between this type of economic crisis right now and others? And in relation to that, whether you agree or not with Dan's stance on that, I guess he just clarified in terms of there not being an international socialist movement like there was in, let's say, Lenin's time. And so how can you, if you think that is true or not, and if not, how do you, if you do, how do you reconcile that with this, with your claim that this conflict right now is creating the grounds for a working class movement?
I don't totally understand the second part of the question.
Do you agree with Dan when he says that there isn't an international socialist movement like there was in Lenin's time?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Well, maybe here's a way of putting the question that was raised actually by somebody in the chat is, are there, okay, so both Daniel and Andy said that you wanted an anti-war movement, a working class anti-war movement. Perhaps the objective conditions are or will be there, but are the subjective conditions present?
Okay.
I think that's kind of what Rosa's question to you was getting at.
Okay, yeah, thanks for those questions. Well, first, yeah, it's good to clarify what I meant. The movements I was referring to as petty bourgeois were January 6th, the Stop the Steal movement, and the broader like anti-vax, anti-COVID mandate movement. I see these as being, although there's a lot of working class people who were on the ground, who participated in these things, and are inspired by them, maybe didn't participate, but like really agree with them. The logic of it, I think, has to do with middle class people who are feeling their status lessened by regulation, by loss of status in various ways. And so these very assertive, rebellious-looking movements become, to a lot of working class people, what it looks like to challenge the state and challenge power. And that's really dangerous. But it's also something I can't even pretend to support, because I see the class basis of it as being something reactionary to what I believe in. Now, if there's the same type of or aesthetic movement that's about the rising cost of living and the immiseration of everyday life, and maybe it merges in some way with this kind of like anti-work or great resignation movement or vibe out there, then you might see actual working class proletarian politics come to the fore of it, although it's aesthetically still captured by petty bourgeois aesthetics or goals. That's what I'm worried about. So that's why I think something based on consumption might be a little bit different.
Dan, I wonder if you have anything to say to that, just because it seems as though you and Andy are in some ways rehashing kind of the old Second International debate, or even prior to that, debate between the anarchists and the Marxists about economic versus political struggle.
Well, perhaps. I mean, I think that we just can't have another sort of like another more social movements of the kind we've had before. We have to have a working class movement and a working class socialist leadership, and that means a revolutionary party, or many parties competing for the leadership of the working class. But it's got to be a socialist movement, not simply these very ephemeral middle class movements. And as of January 6th, January 6th was a quasi-fascist uprising. It was an attempted coup d'etat. And socialists can't have anything to do with that at all. And I think the U.S. is facing a grave constitutional crisis. And I think if things go the way they think they're going, we actually may be approaching the end of anything resembling formal democracy in this country. And when you couple that with growing militarism and savage, recession, then we're entering into a very dark period, which will not have room for those middle-class movements, and will only find a way out of it if the working class mobilizes itself. And of course, the subjective factor is entirely absent. That's what distinguishes our age from Lenin's age, where even in the United States, socialist consciousness had made great inroads, and now it's almost entirely absent. But that has got to change. And so, yes, we're coming from a period of underdevelopment, but we've got to move to a period of development and develop this movement and the political consciousness that goes with it.
We've got 10 more minutes left, and so I wanted to ask, would you like to ask a question?
I would just like to ask a follow-up to that previous question then. So, we know that, say, the lower your income is, the more of that disposable income gets spent on essentials like food or energy. How do you manage, perceptions around the backlash to the supply shock we're going to see and the effects on oil prices and food prices? How do you preempt that being, cast as reactionary, white supremacist, what have you? More broadly, how do you avoid the, American left from becoming or appearing to become just an interest vehicle of the upper middle class, let's say?
Well, I think revolutionaries should be ready to go with answers to those questions. It's like, inflation's happening, here's why. Part of it is we're paying for this war. And I think everyone's going to agree with that. And so the quicker that we can preempt the right from making this about we're paying for the war and that's why we need Trump back because we didn't have the war under Trump, the better we're in a position to steer this towards something proletarian and not something led by the Trump movement. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Jen Psaki, the White House spokesman, put out a statement today, a video saying, this is Putin's gas price increase. It's the Putin gas hike, and this is what the left has got to fight. He says, no, it's not the Putin gas hike; it's the NATO gas hike, because it's NATO that's causing it. So that's what the task of the left is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ideological confusion out there. And it's true, if Zelensky hadn't been so keen to become a pawn of NATO, the thing could have been settled many months ago, and there wouldn't have been an invasion of Ukraine. But Zelensky was so keen to become the comedian frontman for US imperialism, as well as the local fascist brigades, that he just couldn't let it be. He was doing the bidding for US imperialism. And Russia is now presenting the bill. He doesn't like it. It looks nasty. It's mean. But that is the consequence of NATO encirclement of Russia for years and years and years. Putin has warned the West not to push it any further. The West said, well, fuck you. We're going to keep going. Zelensky said, sign me up. We want to join NATO. Georgia, we want to join NATO too. Everybody wants to be part of it. And Russia said, nope, not going to happen. This is why it's happening. And I think the problem is that a large part of the left does not understand that or does not want to understand this. And now everybody goes like, oh, we think war is bad. That is not the issue. It's not a moral question. The question is, who is ultimately the aggressor here? And the simple answer is NATO. Putin reacts to NATO aggression. What would you do if your house was surrounded by people with guns doing military exercises in your backyard and saying, we're going to fuck you over. Are you going to go, yeah, that's fine. So, why? We shouldn't be surprised.
Wait, I didn't hear that. What was that, please?
Stand up. I guess, what would you do? I guess I would unleash my artillery on civilian districts. That's a reasonable thing to do, right?
Why don't we take
Yeah.
the last question, and then I'm going to wrap us
Yeah,
up
okay.
in a second.
Yeah, thank you for giving this panel. And I think this is more to Christoph and Daniel. Just based on what you said about, I guess, the consciousness of socialists in the US, and also like, I don't know, I just feel like the US right now, the people in the US are so brainwashed by, I guess, the liberal rhetorics, and also like just everything is about human rights, and everything in the political field is about, I don't know, I just think it's not like that in, because I'm from China, so I think it's not like that in like other like third world countries who, I guess our people are really conscious of like the suppression of the imperialists and how we should actually thrive, or we should actually fight against this power. And I don't even know if this is a question, but I'm just trying to bring in a new perspective and to see like how you think the socialists or the workers or this class can actually, I guess, escape from this brainwash and to actually speak for themselves and to recognize the situation. Yeah, that's my question.
America has been the most successful imperialist country in history. I mean, other people, talked about conquering the globe, but only America has really come close. And due to the failure of a left movement, which was crushed in the early 1920s, really, there's no competing force. So the imperialists, the capitalists have the field to themselves. They're able to brainwash the population. And we know what it is. We know that there's this deep feeling of patriotism and identification with America, that America is this transcendent force, and this great belief in American exceptionalism and American imperialism. But this is leading to the growing militarization of our society and the growing impoverishment. And I think that process will hugely accelerate as a consequence of this war. And so that will throw workers into action. They'll be, their wages will be cut. They'll be laid off. They won't be able to feed their kids. They won't be able to pay the rent. This is the seeds of an immense social explosion are being sown. So, and we've seen this process, for several decades now, but it's going to accelerate. And I think that first workers will be sort of shocked and stunned, and maybe will fall back. But eventually, and I'm sure sooner rather than later, they will start fighting back, and then we have the potential for a massive social explosion.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that people in China have a better sense of US imperialism than people in the US. And I think partly that has to do with the fact that China was both a colony at some stage, as well as a country that underwent a social revolution, albeit somewhat deformed under Mao. And I think the fact that in the US things are very unclear to people has to do with its history, and some of it finds expression in the fact that there is not even a deformed expression of the working class as an organized force in politics. There is no Labor Party as such. It doesn't exist. You only have the Republicans and the Democrats, who are essentially the same. So that goes to show that there has been no expression developed organizationally of class interests in this country beyond the trade union level, but not on the political level. So how do we change that? It's very difficult. And I think one of the things that makes people change their mind about stuff is when they see successes. Nothing is as sexy as success. The Bolshevik Revolution attracted millions of people because it was a successful overturn of an oppressive regime of capitalism. People flocked to, not literally the Soviet Union, but to the ideas and the ideals and the values of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, we don't have that. It's long in the past. But any success that we can achieve here, whether it is in an anti-war strike against US imperialism, that kind of anti-war strike, or a movement against cop violence, those are things that people can identify with because they can see that something can be done against the oppressor. And that mobilizes people because we feel isolated. And when we see that together, we can take on the tyrant, we want to be part of that because that feels good, that feels liberating in the act of rebellion. And that is why I'm saying success will attract more people. And it can start small, but it can also grow as you draw more people in.
Okay, thank you guys. To wrap this up, I would like to ask one question that I think many of the other smaller discussions we've had tonight kind of point to, and that I hope will be the occasion for kind of closing remarks, summaries, anything that you want to say, which is that there seems to be an assumption through all of the different presentations tonight, and even to a certain extent yours, Andy, though you've kind of attempted to sidestep the question of imperialism, that weakening US power or hegemony on a global scale will bring us closer to socialism and revolution on some level. Why is that the case? How could that be the case in the absence, as has been noted by Daniel on this panel several times, of any sort of subjective revolutionary factor?
So I think weakening US imperialism has a benefit for the people around the world. And I'll just quote one example that everybody will be familiar with, and that's the Vietnam War. The fact that the US lost meant that for quite some time their foreign policy was a little bit more cautious because they were still living under the trauma of being defeated in Vietnam. It's a real thing. If you get a beating, you're not as cocky when you walk around anymore. For socialists, it is important to inflict defeats on imperialism so that they are less able to pick more and more victims in the future. That's how it works. And I think for us, there is a responsibility to distinguish between the aggressor and the intended victim in this conflict. I leave you with one thought. If missiles are launched from a territory of Ukraine, they take about 5 to 10 minutes to hit Moscow. That's all the time that is left for the Russian military to figure out, is this a real attack? Is it maybe a maneuver? Is it an error in the computer system, or what is going on, before they press the button? The actions of the United States and their NATO allies in Ukraine are bringing us one big step closer to World War III because of increased danger of those kind of incidents happening, whether intended or not, but it is a fact. And that is what imperialism does. It brings us closer to World War III.
Actually, my approach is actually a little bit different. I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, if American imperialism were to somehow be destroyed tomorrow, we could have a world that was that was poor and disorganized, with 1,001 local conflicts without any larger organizing principle. I mean, the analogy that comes to mind is the fall of the Roman Empire in 476. And it gave way to to a multitude of little warring factions that that's led to the Dark Ages. And I don't know. That's just an analogy. It's hard to imagine the same process happening now. But still, if if the U.S. imperialism dies and there's nothing to replace it, then we could have, an ever more barbaric struggle of an ever greater number of petty potentates, just plunging the world into anarchy. So yes, we have to replace U.S. imperialism with a system of global democracy, global socialist democracy, so that we can raise so we can do all the great things we want to do. We can raise the standard of living for 7.9 million people. We can conquer global warming. We can have peace. We can have further technological development, which truly raises the level of culture and material conditions, et cetera, et cetera. But that requires global democracy and a kind of a free-form anarchy that merely the removal of U.S. imperialism might lead to would be equally as disastrous.
Yeah, I think that obviously the focusing on these objective questions of geopolitics and the war and no matter how we qualify the war, it exists, and I think that's why a lot of people are going to be turned off from a concept of something like the anti-war movement or the proper analysis of it or something. It's there, and no protest is going to end it. So I think that's why I'm focusing, my focus is a little bit different in terms of what's made the proletariat really take the offensive over the last 10 years. Where has the subjective factor come from? And in the United States, the biggest proletarian uprising was the George Floyd uprising. Like you mentioned, people in this neighborhood in Minneapolis saw someone that they knew, their neighbor, be murdered because he was trying to pass a bad 20 or something, trying to rip off the store for $20. He got killed for that. And these people got together, hundreds of them, and burned down the police station where the cops that killed him worked. And that wasn't just a neighborhood action. It sent a signal to the entire country that the United States government was vulnerable. And a report just came out this last week from the Minneapolis Police Department that part of the reason they were vulnerable was because of the pandemic, was because they hadn't really trained for something like that happening during the pandemic, which is interesting. So I think that, the pandemic is a subjective thing, it's a subjective fact, and no matter how we analyze it, we can't really have the correct line. The proletariat learns the lessons that it has to learn from it. And part of that is we're going to have to pay for this pandemic one way or another, and they might kill us for it, but also the state's going to be weaker, and we can fight back. And I think maybe that's a model for where we're seeing an anti-war movement. Not the anti-war movement like Iraq, where you protest in the millions and nothing's achieved, but something more like the George Floyd uprising in comparison to the first round of Black Lives Matter, where you don't just protest, but you go on the offensive.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to the Radical Society.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, no problem. As a reminder, we would like to thank the Park Church Co-op for allowing us to have this discussion free of charge. There's a donation box in the back, and I will be there to help people give donations over Venmo. Platypus can be found in New York City on campus at Columbia University, NYU, the New School, and Hunter College. If you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or just go on platypus1917.org and email one of the emails there. And you can find us most Mondays at Cafe Reggio by NYU at 6 p.m. So thank you, everybody, and thank you. Have a nice night.
That's a good ultra.
We should have
Good.
Aaron, you have our emails are on the email you sent